Hello, my name is Christina, and I live on the unceded territories of the Tsimshian Nation. I am Métis, and my family originally comes from across the prairies, but we're really fortunate to be guests in northern British Columbia. I'm excited to share this topic, which is going to take a look at Indigenous leadership perspectives. And I was inspired to explore this because I was working on a Master's of Leadership. And leadership is a social construct. So many of the examples that we covered were your typical views of leaders that were Western tradition, European leaders. And it really caused me to reflect on Indigenous leadership and what that looks like and how we can explore leadership as a social construct. So to begin with, you're going to need to take a look at your pre-module activity and complete that. The PDF is downloadable. And also, I want to state that this particular lesson is an opportunity to learn that can be shared in groups. I think learning is often better in community. So feel free to take this to people that are your colleagues or peers or family and have them follow along so you can share together. As I mentioned before, my perspective on leadership has been influenced by my family, culture, and experience living in northern British Columbia and originally in Alberta. When we're taking a look at the idea of decolonizing a concept, it's important to include Indigenous leadership as part of that. Importantly, Indigenous communities are not all the same, and we have many of them. There are 630 Indigenous communities across Canada, representing 50 nations and with 50 different languages. Leadership is affected by our paradigm, how we see the world and ourselves in it. And so it's the idea of the leader and the follower can look different for different communities and cultures. In our first activity, I'm asking for you to take a pencil or a pen and a paper and reflect on how you see the connection between a leader and a follower and to present that in a visual image. So that's going to be our first activity, and please pause for activity 1. One of the things with history that has really fascinated me is how leadership emerges and how groups choose their leaders. And so there's many different ways of viewing this in history. There's examples, and I'm just going to go through some ideas of how follower-leader relationship evolves. So one would be domination over. So there is an idea that the leader of maybe a country or a community is hierarchical and that they are above the people that follow them. Another example would be like trait-based influence, where followers are looking for traits such as strength, wealth, power, and they're attracted to that, and that is how they choose their leader, and the leader emerges. Another thing would be drivership. So for example, some people are leaders because they can coerce their followers to do various things, and you see that in some cultures. Influence through behaviors, which would maybe be pro-social, so promising things so that they can attract followers. Cooperative actions in groups ties to that. And then there's motivational leadership, where the followers want to be like the leader, or the leader is motivating them towards certain actions or ideas. And then we have leading through service. So that's actually an emerging theory, which is a servant leadership. And quite closely connected is the idea of authentic leadership, which is quite attractive to our current society, where leaders are modeling behaviors that are highly valued and are very honest and authentic about their struggles and also their successes. So that is a new way leadership is viewed. I'm going to highlight a personal description of an Indigenous concept of leadership. And this is shared in community because Indigenous culture is not individualistic. It's often quite community-based. Now, I cannot speak to all Indigenous cultures. I can only speak from a Métis perspective, and each culture and nation across our country is unique. I'm just going to share my perspective. I always think of leadership in terms of a circle, and the leader-follower relationship is in terms of taking a turn or sharing power, as opposed to one person possessing all of the power. I see followers and leaders as equal contributors in a community. When you look at a wolf pack, the wolf that's the leader is often in the back, and that's to make sure that no wolves are left behind. And it's actually the oldest wolf that can be at the front with the most experience. And talking about Indigenous leadership, It's important to note that just like the wolves and the leader being at the back, Indigenous leaders do not promote themselves. They lead from the back of the community. They are supporters. They are servant leaders. They could be seen as authentic leaders, but what you expect the leader to look like may not be how they portray themselves. I am very much used to and comfortable with a leader not wanting to self-promote. And that is highlighted in our community. As we head into our next activity, I'd like you to pause the video and we're going to do activity 2. Just to review Indigenous leadership, we are looking at concepts of shared leadership, communal values rather than individualism, and a flatter leadership structure. These perspectives influence Indigenous leaders' priorities. Indigenous leadership priorities include knowledge sharing, self-determination, and community advocacy. So I briefly mentioned that Indigenous leaders have very specific priorities. And one of the first things that I stated was knowledge sharing. Knowledge sharing is a priority as part of what leadership looks like. So the first strand actually of Indigenous leadership, according to Kalafi 2019, embodies what is known, how it has come to be known, and the way in which it is reflected on through self-knowledge and self-reflection. Notably, Indigenous knowledge is referred to as traditional, Indigenous norms and social values, as well as mental constructs that guide, organize, and regulate, yet remain in opposition to imposed colonial norms and practices. The unique way of looking at knowledge sharing, which is separate than colonial, is held in storytelling, ceremonies, art, dancing, ideologies, stewardship of land, nature, spirituality, teaching, the way we teach, innovation, and food storage, as well as natural holistic medicine. Indigenous knowledge is held intergenerationally, and so often a leader will be someone who protects that knowledge and passes it on to others. And that can be a very quiet, simple role in our community, and yet it holds great importance. The point is to pass knowledge to the next generation, and this is a big piece of what leadership is. Hereditary chiefs, which are often referenced in media or on the news. In fact, there's a lot of discussion over why a hereditary chief is not maybe the actual chief of the nation in a colonial sense. And we do have this issue where hereditary chiefs are often not recognized by the Western world. And yet in our communities, hereditary chiefs are leaders. So there is a guiding principle with ways of knowing that Indigenous people decide what is the best practice in working with their knowledge and their ownership of that knowledge. A great example of this is in Australia, where the land and sea management has now been handed to Indigenous people through Our Knowledge, Our Way, and they decide how they're going to share their knowledge. And when they do, they hold that knowledge as proprietary. Another priority of Indigenous leaders is around self-determination. And especially since the UN and UNDRIP has been implemented, stating publicly and officially to the provinces and communities that they have the right to self-determine, this is a process that the communities and leaders are starting to negotiate, especially around partnerships. And my interest in this relates to education and who determines the educational partnerships, goals, objectives, and Indigenous leaders are stepping into the space of that discussion. The next activity is going to take a look at how we see power, and specifically around the leader-follower relationship, and reflect on how it would be different for a religious leader or a family member or a parent and maybe even a boss. How much power does the follower have versus the leader? So in terms of power, one of the concerns in healthcare is around who has control to make decisions. And in colonization, a loss of being able to have control over daily matters in one's life. This does affect healthcare concerns and remains a conversation and barrier to improving healthcare outcomes. Self-determination means making your own choices, speaking up when you're not happy about something, having control over your own life, being willing to try new things, figuring out what you do and don't like, asking for help when you need it, knowing the whole story, and taking responsibility for your decisions. Indigenous leaders are not only focused on knowledge sharing and self-determination, they are advocates for their community, and they want to self-determine how that advocacy looks. Eurocentric knowledge still affects different social structures that we have and that we deal with in our communities. And decolonizing does not look the same for every community. It does not look the same for every people. It is not experienced the same way. And so leadership actually demands that being part of the conversation for how we decolonize, what reconciliation looks like, what are the reparative actions that are needed, and those need to be self-determined. So how the leadership structure affects how Indigenous individuals actually connect with those structures. And so I'm going to give some examples. In the school structure, we have a hierarchy still similar to the Queen and King now, and how the governments are structured in Western thinking. Schools have a principal, then they have a teacher. It's all hierarchical, not a circle, not shared learning, not ways of knowing. So the Indigenous students still experience that differently. Politics, again, you have prime minister and there's a hierarchy. Healthcare is another place where the structure of how the healthcare community works does affect our Indigenous young people who are coming in as workers, as well as our members in the community and specifically residential school survivors, and how much power they have in that environment to advocate for themselves and their community. Also, addressing the determination of Indigenous health means acknowledging that the concept of health extends beyond physical elements to include a range of factors that influence the physical, mental, spiritual, and social well-being of Indigenous peoples. In conclusion, a lot of the decolonization conversation ties to how leadership is experienced in terms of power. Indigenous leadership priorities, whether it's knowledge sharing, self-determination, or advocacy, is completely community focused. And so this ties to our next activity, where you are asked to illustrate how your identity is tied to your cultural community, and drawing a circle, coloring it in a percentage of your time that you would prioritize around your cultural activities and community. How do you think a sense of community or individualism impacts the focus of the leader's advocacy? As a Métis person, I was very excited to attend graduate school. I'm currently also working on a Master's of Education. In terms of working on my Master's of Leadership, not once was there an Indigenous leader that was brought forward as an example of leadership. And that kind of shocked me, but it also made me really aware that we want to bring forward examples of leadership. The first leader I'm going to bring up is a wonderful leader who has shone in our country, and her name is Sheila Watt-Cloutier. There was a little Inuit girl who grew up in the cold north of Canada in the territory known as Nunavut. Her mother was a respected elder and healer, and her father she never met because at that time there were many European explorers who came and went. So she was raised by her mother and maternal grandmother. They lived by the ways of snow and ice, which means that she was trained in a traditional lifestyle which included food and animal preparation and clothing manufacturing. Traveling by dog sled remained the primary source of mobility and sustenance for Arctic families during the 1950s and 1960s, with hunting and ice fishing comprising a significant portion of their living strategies during the prolonged winter and short, mild summers. During her childhood, her people lived in a reality where everything mattered and everything was connected. This little girl at the age of 10 was very smart and was selected to go to school far from her home and her community, attending school in Nova Scotia. During this time, she lost aspects of her language and her culture. 2 years later, she was moved to Manitoba and then selected to complete school in Ottawa. The tumult of frequent moves yielded academic struggle for this little girl. A school counselor discouraged her from following her dream of applying to medical school because of her poor math and science grades. At the age of 18, disillusioned and missing home, Watt-Cloutier returned to Fort Chamo, now known as Kutuak. There she worked in the hospital for 4 years, and she dealt with drugs, addiction, chronic health problems, family violence, all faced in her community. She saw the poor living conditions and a loss of cultural healing practices. She got married, moved with her 2 children, and then began working for the school board. Sheila Watt-Cloutier established a committee that set up a childcare facility and playgrounds in their community. And then she began advocating for Inuit families with social breakdown that led to drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and suicide. After returning to Kutuak, Watt-Cloutier began taking courses in student counseling and education offered through McGill University. She began working full-time at the local school where she witnessed firsthand the disastrous effect that the breakdown of Indigenous livelihood had on her people. Sheila Watt-Cloutier responded by advocating for students. She began a drug and alcohol rehabilitation program in her home community. She helped commission the Regional Health Board to study health struggles in the North. She advocated for education improvements. She participated in the making of the film Capturing Spirit, The Inuit Journey, which was released in 1998. The film shone a light on the remarkable resilience, yet tragic circumstances of Inuit communities who continue to deal with high rates of suicide, addiction, and poverty because of a loss of cultural identity and the ongoing effects of colonial trauma. She began advocating politically around environmental climate change and its impact on Inuit people. She was an active collaborator in the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. She wrote the book The Right to Be Cold and won the BC National Award for Canadian Nonfiction and the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. She filed the world's first legal action on climate change. Sheila Watt-Cloutier was honored with the Aboriginal Achievement Award for Environment and holds a United Nations Champion of the Earth Award. Lastly, she was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for her environmental and political activism on behalf of her people. Indigenous leaders carry a huge burden. They see their community needs, and they want to be part of the conversation around advocacy. They want to see their community self-determine answers to their own problems. They share power with the community. And there are many other examples of Indigenous leaders that align with these perspectives. Some Indigenous leaders make art to tell stories. Some keep knowledge in terms of medicine or environment, health. There are many different aspects of leadership. And in all cases that I know, I have seen strong advocacy and community focus.
Indigenous leadership is community-centric, the result of relationship and connection with one another. Each individual is part of a whole with responsibilities and leadership value. The power dynamic between leader and follower aims to honor the individual self-determination of each. Meanwhile, the valuing of community results in knowledge sharing, art, cultural structure, and a shared narrative. To me, the image is holistic, referencing the symbiotic relationships we observe in nature. We are intertwined together and represent the infinite potential.